Welcome to the 4D Talks, a podcast about the fourth dimension of architecture, aka all the things that architects should consider in their designs, but often don't. In each episode, my guests and I discuss how this fourth dimension can influence our experience in the built environment and how we could use it to make better architecture that serves people and improves their life. Architects, students, and architecture enthusiasts, join the brainstorm and let's discover the fourth dimension together. Designing with nature as the fourth dimension of architecture is one of the sexiest trends these days. Today, however, we will explore how nature influences architecture in ways that go far beyond the visible aesthetics. We will discuss the science behind nature-centric architecture and understand better how it isn't just visually pleasing, but it's a fundamental aspect of creating spaces that enhance well-being. Let's delve into this topic together with Oliver Heath, an architect and founder of Oliver Heath Design Consultancy, specializing in well-being of people and planet. Thank you, Oliver, for joining me today.
Thank you. It's a real honor to be talking to you today. Thank you for inviting me.
Nature is such a broad topic, and I believe we could try to maybe divide it a little bit into scales. So let's start with the basics of the basics. Let's start also with the urban scale. What are the benefits of designing cities with nature in mind, and how do you see that topic altogether?
The role that nature plays in the built environment, I think, is sort of growing exponentially at the moment. People are recognizing that we can't just create a sustainable built environment by measuring carbon. But there are so many other factors to creating happy, healthy, forward-thinking cities, architecture and interior spaces that we occupy. And there are so many benefits that it's amazing that we're not sort of recognizing this. I mean, first of all, as human beings, we evolved in close connection to healthy forms of nature for our basic human survival for hundreds of thousands of years. So we've known forever that if a place is flourishing and filled with life, then it's somewhere that can support life. A space with natural light, fresh air, plants and greenery, water, wood for building, rocks for building, or for weapons, shelter, warm security from caves. So we've needed all of these things for hundreds of thousands of years. Then at some point, potentially, let's say during the Industrial Revolution, we tended to sort of turn our back and go, human beings are incredible. We are the master of everything. We've got technology that is going to just sort of like do away with nature. We don't need any of that stuff. We're going to just create technologically advanced cities. We don't need that, and nature is sort of unpredictable. It's dangerous. It's dirty. We can use technology to kind of create a better world for ourselves. And so we tend to sort of turn our backs on the value of nature. And now, fast forward several hundred years from the Industrial Revolution, and we're seeing the impact of human intervention on the wider natural environment. We're starting to recognize the impact that climate change and biodiversity loss is having on the spaces, and in particular, the cities that we're living in. Now, around the world, we're seeing unprecedented events taking place, forest fires, flooding, all sorts of kind of like catastrophic and very sort of dramatic weather events taking place, massive biodiversity loss. And this is largely caused by human intervention. And so what we're now seeing in the built environment is a real interest in the role that nature plays in creating healthier, more sustainable, and dare I say it, regenerative places to live and work, places that are better for people, but also places that are better for nature and the planetary environment as a whole. So when we bring nature into cities, it can have all sorts of very obvious benefits. When we bring trees into cities, it can reduce the urban heat island effect. It can reduce flooding dramatically. It can remove toxins, remove CO2, produce oxygen, sequester CO2. It can create habitats that can support other forms of life, such as fauna. And it can also help us to create food. And at the very simplest level, for a human-centered benefit, it can create more desirable spaces for us to inhabit. Just think about the delight of sitting in the shade of a tree on a hot summer's day and seeing birds and insects fly by. So enormous benefits of bringing nature in and the consideration of green infrastructure into our cities.
Exactly like you mentioned, it's not just about the greenery. I think it's about taking all the elements of nature into account. And I would really like to promote the idea of looking into cities as sort of interconnected systems. So the water is not just the water of one building, the intake and the extra. I think if we really looked in terms of how the whole wind sort of blows through the city, or how water flows through the city, we would have so much more potential also to use it somehow to our advantage. There are already simulations being done, more and more technologies being used in that sense, which is great, but I think it's still very much sort of focused on specific buildings rather than, or maybe districts at best, but not really in terms of how the whole city is sort of functioning with water, with greenery, as you mentioned, with sunlight as well. So it's a very multi-layered topic.
I was talking with Ludo Pitti from WSP recently, and they're talking about this idea of cities as forests, and we need to go maybe even a little bit further than that, thinking of the entire ecological system that a city occupies and has influence over, and think of it as a self-sustaining circular system. But then sort of start to get down to the slightly more granular or architectural level and think of buildings operating in a similar way as trees. They are habitats that we are creating that create a circular system that only use the energy they really need. They don't tend to store energy. They create sort of nutrients as the leaves fall off. They produce fruits, create clean air. So maybe we do need to be thinking in a much more scaled way, and not just thinking as, the sort of city-wide complex, but then also take it down to, the urban realm, the piece of architecture. And remember, we spend 90% of our lives indoors. So it's difficult not to go, well, what's that occupant experience, and how can we perpetuate that experience from a city to the public realm to the piece of architecture, but then actually within the space that we occupy where we spend so much of our lives. So we need to kind of think of that whole kind of habitation system and how it can operate in a similar natural way.
Yeah, definitely. I think we have to look in each scale sort of on one hand separately, on the other hand we sort of also have to zoom out and look at it as the whole system. Something that you mentioned, comparing a building to a tree, reminds me of the idea of the biomimicry, right? And biomimic architecture?
Biomimetic architecture, yes.
Biomimetic architecture. What is that? Maybe let's start here.
Well, biomimicry is slightly different to the world that I occupy, which is more biophilic, but biomimicry is really how buildings and products and materials can learn from natural systems and from natural evolution over the last several sort of billion years. So it takes inspiration from the sort of cyclical, very poetic quality that nature has developed over that period, and seeks to mimic that in the built environment or as a product. So at its very simplest level, it might look at the footprint of a gecko and see how the gecko manages to kind of walk up a wall from the hairs on its feet and mimic those hairs in a product. Or the invention of Velcro comes from a guy who was walking his dog and found those little kind of thistly burrs on his dog and went, okay, there's something interesting between the fur of my dog and this bristle. Maybe there's an opportunity for a product. So that is a biomimetically inspired product. Architects like Michael Paulin and David Kirkland have done incredible sort of iterations of that on a much larger scale, envisioning how biomimetics could inspire a circular operating system for an entire building. And when you look at some of the buildings they've created, absolutely beautiful, so poetic in the way that they mimic elements of nature. And it's a great shame that we haven't seen more real life examples of that come to fruition.
I think biomimicry kind of, it has a similar start as biophilic design has in terms of loving architecture and being inspired by architecture. But it seems to me that for now, this is more about using technology mostly to sort of use the same principles as happen with animals or plants and translate them using technology into architecture, which might be fascinating. Like, we can have buildings that inspired by sunflowers are moving their shape so that they can get more sunlight, for example. Or we can have some air purifying concrete or I think slowly we're also using a bit more of the idea of the bioluminescence. There's this artist in the Netherlands, Dan Rosehade. I think he's been doing some stuff with it. But that's still sort of on a, I'm not sure if we could call all of these ideas sustainable. I think these are all very sexy words, but they very often have not much to do with being ecological or being sustainable. How do you see that topic?
Well, I mean, I think at an architectural scale, it's very interesting. It allows you to think of a building as a living system. And if you think of a tree, you know, it takes its energy from the sun. That energy is sort of transferred within the leaves, and it creates the energy. It draws water from the earth. It has it doesn't store any energy, and at the end of a sort of the summer season, the leaves fall off, create nutrients, and so it creates a circular system. So there's that sort of biomimetic purity that actually many buildings could mimic. But I would agree with you that biomimicry is more of an engineering-based solution to the built environment, whereas biophilic design, and biophilia means a love of nature, explains humans' innate attraction to nature and natural principles. So it's a human-centered approach that recognizes that as human beings, we've evolved in close connection to nature, and we retain a genetic inheritance that means that when we spend time in and around us, it makes us feel more calm and relaxed. And as a result of reducing the stress and aiding recuperation, it allows us to actually perform the functions of the buildings that we're supposed to be doing much more efficiently, but also reduces some of the negative impacts. And I think more of us are recognizing that connection, particularly through lockdown, where we weren't able to get that rich diversity of spatial experience. We were able to get out and go to a local park or a river or the beach and spend time in there. And that was something of a savior for a lot of people. So people were recognizing that. Often when I give a talk, I ask the very sort of simple question, which is think of a space where you feel most happy, calm, and relaxed, and picture that space in your mind. That's really interesting. When I ask this in a crowd at a live talk, about 95% of people put their hands up when I say, does the space you're thinking of right now contain natural light, sunlight, clouds, trees, maybe mountains, grasses, flowers, maybe a body of water? And everybody has this sort of similar picture. And everyone looks around and went like, wow, that's weird. What, you all really think that nature is your favorite space as well? And they're like, nobody can quite believe it. Occasionally, of course, a few people say, oh no, it's the pub, or it's just lying in bed or lounging on my sofa. But generally, it's people have this kind of desire to be in and around nature. And it's interesting how when we then create the built environment, just how different the spaces are in their form and shape and experience to the spaces that we'll ultimately want to be in. So there has been this sort of divergence, and now what we're starting to see is a reconvergence towards a desire to create more bio-based approaches to design. So biomimicry is one, biomorphism, where we copy nature's shapes, is another, and biophilic design really investigates that human-nature connection and the benefits it brings within the built environment.
I think it's been a topic already on architects' agenda for quite some years, which is a good thing here, because we're not really talking only about what people like. We actually have evidence for why it works, right? Like scientific proofs, what kind of benefits it has, both psychological benefits and also physical benefits. So shall we talk maybe a little bit more about that, like give real numbers?
Yeah.
For instance, I was reading recently that at schools that are designed with biophilic principles, kids can get better results in memory tests by 25%. That the creativity also can increase by 20% compared to productivity, which actually also raises, but it's less. Apparently, biophilic design has more impact on creativity than productivity. We're also talking about hospitals. People actually recover faster in environments that have biophilic principles or are designed with biophilic principles. Work environments, what could you add to it? I'm sure you can say a lot about that.
Yeah, I mean, this is for me one of the most interesting things. When I studied architecture, psychology was a small module, but a really interesting one. I was like, why do we not look more at the psychology of space, but we're so focused on hero worship of other architects. So, when I was studying architecture in Oxford and at the Bartlett, there was so much sort of fascination with the successful big name architects, the modernists, I suppose, and some of the architects that sort of followed that initial movement. But then since leaving and becoming interested in this sort of idea of evidence-based design, it's incredible how much research there is about the way shapes and forms and elements within the built environment can have an enormous impact on everyday occupants. People that aren't or haven't necessarily studied architecture and design. And across every building typology, we've seen benefits being delivered. And essentially what we find is that when we bring elements of nature in, it has this ability to kind of reduce some of the negative effects of buildings that we see as a result of stress and fatigue and burnout, but also improve some of those outcomes. So of course, in schools, like you said, we've seen incredible numbers of access and optimization of daylight, increasing the speed of learning by between 20 and 26%. The speed of learning, that's amazing. There's a 5 to 14% improvement in test scores. Even the use of natural timbers in classrooms has the ability to reduce student heart rates by 8,600 beats per day. It's kind of amazing, isn't it?
That's insane.
Yeah. There was a really interesting seminal study by a psychologist called Roger Ulrich in the healthcare environment. And what he did is he had this study where he looked at patients' recovery rates coming out of gallbladder surgery over a 5-year period. So it wasn't sort of looking at, patients coming out day to day. This was over a really long period of time. What he found was that the patients were recuperating in 2 different types of room in this particular hospital. One had a view onto a brick wall and one had a view onto trees and greenery. And what he found was that as he did this, was that the patients that were recuperating in spaces with views onto trees and greenery actually recuperated 8.5% faster. So that's nearly 10%. That's amazing. Subsequent studies have shown that the patients that recuperate in natural light feel less pain, and as a result, need 22% less postoperative pain care medication. So, patients get better faster, they feel less pain. Obviously, it's going to be good for those people that work in hospitals, doctors, nurses, support staff, who work in incredibly life or death, stressful life or death situations. And these numbers are just sort of repeated across all different building typologies, whether it's workplace productivity being improved by sort of 6 to 8%, well-being improved by 15%, creativity going up by 15%. It sort of goes on and on, depending on what sort of building typology you're looking at. There is an absolute wealth of evidence and research that is peer-reviewed out there that goes far beyond the work of any of your hero architects, that just says, if we include elements of nature and we enhance that connection to it, it will reduce stress, aid recuperation, reduce some of those negative effects. But not only that, it will enhance occupants' experience of spaces, places, and also the connections to people within them. So it's very good to enhance a sense of community within the built environment. So, the sort of list of benefits is kind of amazing. And once you start to look into this evidence, you go, well, what's the evidence behind, I don't know, let's say Gothic or the post-Gothic styles or modernism? It's like, well, it's kind of a bit thin, isn't it? How does that actually stack up? So this evidence base, I think, is so important, and it's kind of staggering that we don't teach it and learn about it more when we're studying architecture.
I think so too. And I think it's so much related to also, neuropsychology and so many other fields that actually prove that biophilic design makes complete sense.
It's interesting, that idea of sort of neuroscience as well is kind of really interesting, because we tend to talk about biophilic design in 2 ways. There is the neuroscience that looks at how elements of nature can enhance the well-being of individuals. When I look at nature, it makes me feel better, I feel less stressed, and I can recuperate faster. It's also worth recognizing that increasingly we're seeing a greater level of understanding about neurodiversity and how we create more inclusive environments. And we wrote a white paper a little while back for the flooring manufacturer interface that looked at sort of sensory comfort thresholds, which basically sort of touched on this idea of how we create more inclusive spaces and recognition of how we create spaces to support people who recognize as being neurodiverse. And it's worth recognizing actually that 15.5% of the population believe themselves to kind of have Asperger's, autism, dyslexia, dyscalculia, ADHD. So it's quite a large number. And actually remembering that we all experience the built environment in different ways through the senses. Some people are much more sensitive visually, or through their olfactory sense, or through their sense of touch, through the haptic sense. And actually across the day, our sensitivity across all of these senses tends to differ. So if you're stressed out, then if somebody is sort of eating loudly, it's going to really, really annoy you. But if you're more relaxed, it doesn't really matter. But if you've got a deadline and a piece of work, then you're going to become, have a heightened acoustic sense. So we're sort of interested in this idea that actually this level of neurodiversity exists, that we do need to then deliver more diverse sets of spaces so that everybody can pick and choose spaces that supports their individual sensorial state, but also on the task at hand. So this is an interesting idea that, how do we do that when you've got so much diversity of what it is that people like? And we go back to this idea that actually everybody has a desire to be in and around nature. And that if we create spaces that are inspired through rich, natural, diverse settings, then we can offer a series of spaces to people that offer much greater levels of variety and diversity of spaces and furniture and ways to occupy those spaces. So we sort of touched on that sort of neuroscience level. And the other approach that we tend to look at is what we call the socio-psychological approach. And that sort of touches on how the introduction of nature enhances that experience to space and place and the people in it. And as a result of that, when we put elements of nature in, it allows people to have shared experiences of nature come together and facilitate a greater sense of calm and relaxation, give people the opportunity to stop and sit, have a conversation. And from that conversation can come the sharing of ideas and knowledge and skills and resources that is obviously going to be very beneficial for developing and enhancing a sense of community in the built environment.
I think NASA also did research on that, and they've come up with quite some conclusions. Even, I think, translating directly square meters of greenery, how much that increases the productivity at the workplace. Something interesting you're talking about building community. I think it's also very important, especially these days after COVID, when a lot of companies are struggling with getting their employees back. This is also one of the ways, right? And this, the whole topic about senses and how people perceive things. Obviously, there are certain, well, I wouldn't call it standards, but there are ways how human being reacts to things. Then I would like everyone to listen to the other episode with Charles Spence about senses.
Charles Spence is brilliant, isn't he? He is so great. If you should definitely listen to him. I've spoken alongside him and regretted that decision because he's a very entertaining, very knowledgeable speaker. So I would definitely recommend everyone listens to that podcast.
Definitely. What I wanted to now discuss then, because we talked about a lot about the benefits, what are the principles of biophilic design? I think there's also a lot written on that topic online. Actually, the first time I came across your work was through an interface interview years ago. So even before I had podcast, I already knew I'd like to talk with you one day. So what are the principles? What are the main, I mean, the ones that I know are the 6 points, but maybe you have other points to mention.
Oh no, there's loads more than that. No, there's lots more. So it's a concept that's been around since around the 1980s, and it was developed by Eric Fromm and Edward O. Wilson when they started to recognize the humans' departure away from rural dwellings and into city centers, and then many sort of psychological and physiological problems that level of urbanization started to bring. So they kind of penned this word, biophilia, which means the love of nature. And it was an idea that sort of took that evolutionary approach and recognized, that we had this long history and connection with the natural environment. Then it was really Stephen Kellert who started to formulate a series of ideas or what we call patterns of biophilic design and found these ways of bringing it into the built environment to enhance that connection. So Stephen Kellert created enormous lists of dozens and dozens of features, which is, very expansive and very creative. I think there were 78. And then those got sort of refined, and now we tend to use 25 patterns of biophilic design. Now, all of those approaches basically subdivide into three core areas. And the first is what we call a direct connection to nature. And this is the one that people tend to think about. So it's things like the addition of plants and trees, of course, but there's also natural light, fresh air, water, air movement. It's the movement that we see in trees in the wind and ripples moving across a pool of water, and what we call non-rhythmic sensory stimuli. So the direct connection to nature is all those real sensory forms of nature with living things. Now, the second core principle is what we call an indirect connection to nature. And it's how we mimic or evoke a feeling of nature using natural materials, colors, textures, patterns, and even technologies. Now, that's not going to have as strong an effect as real forms of nature, but it's amazing how technology is now mimicking nature in ever more kind of convincing ways. So this idea looks at how I think we in the built environment, and I guess particularly in the world of architecture and interiors, can create natural feeling buildings without necessarily introducing all those kind of direct connections. Now, the third one, which is also interesting and often overlooked, is we basically call the human spatial response. And it recognizes that in nature, nature can be exciting and stimulating and energizing. Think about going surfing or swimming in the cold water, or mountain biking down a hill. There's a massive rush of adrenaline. But it's also calming, relaxing, and restorative. And in a way, we need to create buildings that create both of those types of responses. The excitement and the stimulation of looking over a multi-story building at the ground below and getting that sort of rush of adrenaline and that sense of vertigo, which is exciting. And you might get that from having a treehouse or a swing or a high-level walkway. But also remembering that as human beings, we now live in very, very busy, non-stop, 24/7, super technology saturated environments where we're always on. And as human beings, we were never designed to just be constantly on the go. So what we tend to find now in modern day environments is a sort of increase in stress hormones like cortisol, a much greater level of people getting overly stressed and burnt out. And it's really important that we find ways of creating a built environment that allows people just to stop and sit, to recalibrate, to recuperate, to reset themselves and get back then when they've recuperated to the task at hand. I was listening to one of your podcasts the other day about spirituality and thinking about the kind of lack of our human connection to spiritual spaces like churches and synagogues and mosques. And the effect that has on people is just that on a weekly or daily or weekly basis, people don't have that opportunity just to stop and let their mind wander in the way that they once did for many thousands of years. So I think architects and designers need to find ways of bringing that opportunity for mind wandering and quiet reflection back into the built environment. And the way that we do that best is through looking at the natural world, looking at the gentle reflections of light, the movement that we see, the colors of greenery, the textures, the patterns, the biomorphic shapes, the fractal shapes. There are so many things that we can, as architects and designers, bring into the built environment to create both exciting and stimulating spaces, but also to facilitate that calm recuperation, reflection, and restoration.
Yes, and I think each of these three main principles that you mentioned can really be addressed in very, very different ways. I would like to maybe focus a little bit more on the second part and the third part. So the mimicking and the one that mostly focuses on what kind of feelings it sort of facilitates in people. We can talk also here about even having pictures of nature hanging on the walls, right? Or using green paint. And as you mentioned, I think the principle number one is the most important because that has the biggest impact, and it sort of supercharges the well-being. The other ones are helping. We can also have a little conversation here about then fake versus real plants, because we've been talking about it in our office recently. I started this debate with people, and one like I was always pro real plants. But then I read one interesting point, which was that whatever we perceive as natural already has psychological impact on us as if it was natural. So we're not talking about the physical impact, like, air, like purifying air, but those things that really affect us mentally work even with fake plants. And another aspect of it is then, are all those things then sustainable? Is biophilic design by definition sustainable or not necessarily?
Okay, there's some great questions in there, and some that I get asked quite often, and some that I get asked less. So I guess where should we start? I mean, like you say, the indirect connections to nature support and enhance a perception that an environment is natural. It's never going to be the same as walking through a rich, dense, diverse forest. But let's face reality, many of us are dealing with pieces of architecture in dense urban environments with sort of sensory overload, poor air quality, poor access to natural light and views, poor access to kind of real living forms of nature. So how do we then utilize the patterns of biophilic design to create a space that feels natural? And I think there are many ways of doing that. And actually, interestingly, research has shown again and again that it still can have a physiological benefit. As I mentioned before, the introduction of timber into the built environment has a beneficial effect on schools. And actually, the CBRE carried out a study on the use of timber and its stress-reducing effect. And what they found was actually in a workplace, satisfaction increased by 34% when people could see timber from their workplace setting. Satisfaction with work life increased by 25%. Optimism about the future went up by 17%. Confidence goes up by 19%, and ability to concentrate increases by 18%. So that's just the choice of a particular material. So when we start to look at some of these ideas, you go, oh, well, of course, if that's a flat, blank, white wall, it's just going to be reflecting light. And that light is going to create a lighter environment. But actually, the colors, the textures, the sort of unpredictability of that is going to be beneficial. Now, as human beings, our senses are kind of incredible. And within a tiny split second, we can define whether a material is real or not, whether a piece of timber is a veneer or plastic coated or printed. And then when we touch it, we know instantly that it's not real. So it's worth remembering as designers that if you can use real forms of nature, be that plants and trees, and have real natural light, it's always going to be better. But if you then have to use artificial elements, timber floors or timber balustrades or handrails, the more it's real and not coated in plastic or thick varnishes or veneers, it's going to be better. So research has shown that again and again. So that's that idea of, well, we all use mimics of nature in various ways, but the more natural you can make it feel, and remember that we're seeing it, it's going to affect our senses, our acoustics, maybe our vestibular sense, or maybe our haptic sense, our sense of touch, and create a sense of honesty of natural materials. We're going to create a richer experience. Now, when we get onto the issue of real versus fake plants, then there are various degrees. Now, the way we work it is this. If you can have real plants and you've got enough natural light and enough space, then you should have real plants, because real plants add all sorts of nature benefits to a space. They can modify temperature, humidity, they can remove CO2, remove toxins. They grow and they change over time, so they're dynamic. They react to the environment, and they create physiological and psychological benefits. But of course, if you don't have the space or the light and you're not able to look after them, then maybe it's better to have a representation of nature. So the next level down from that is preserved plants. So you can get sort of saline preserved leaves, and you can get moss that is preserved, and you can use that. And those preserved plants retain that fractal patterning. They look the same. They don't need any maintenance. The coloration might be a little bit different, but they don't grow and develop, and they don't provide all those other sort of ecosystem services to a space. Now go beyond that, and then you get to the kind of the realm of like plastic plants, which obviously send a shudder down the kind of spines of many architects and designers. But the way that we see it is actually they still deliver, they're very, very convincing. They still deliver the visual benefits to a space because they look so similar. And providing you can't touch them and they're not too shiny and too reflective, then they still deliver that sort of fractal, statistical fractal benefit. So what we do is we use real plants where you can touch them, maybe artificial, preserved planting. If it's on a wall or in a darkened space, we only use kind of completely artificial plants in spaces where you can't touch them. Because actually what we find is that as soon as people touch the plant and realize that it's plastic, then you lose all the benefits that a plant might ordinarily deliver because people feel cheated and nobody wants to be made a fool of. So only use them places where people can't touch. Now, 95% of all the suspended plants that you see in shops and galleries and clubs and bars are all plastic and artificial. But because you can't touch them, you don't actually know that. And I'm looking at go, wow, they look really realistic. And it's not until I'm actually on a chair going, no, they're plastic and they're artificial. I go like, I knew they were artificial. By that stage, I'm being sort of ushered out the restaurant by a waiter because I'm not supposed to be on a chair touching the plants. But yeah, it's just very difficult to put plants in certain spaces because it's difficult from a health and safety perspective to look after them when they're high up. It's difficult to water them. There's sort of services up there that you don't want to be getting water on. So yeah, I mean, they're kind of rife throughout our built environment, particularly at the moment because, planting and biophilia is I hate to say it, it's kind of a fashionable thing, but maybe that sort of, on the one hand, is kind of good because at least it's a sort of recognition that well-being, it's become an essential part of how we deliver a better built environment.
And I also think that an approach to plants in general should maybe start a little bit earlier at the beginning of the project rather than consider plants fake or real, as, sometimes I think it's more like we just have a little bit of budget left and we can buy pillows or we can buy plants. So let's just buy some plants. I think biophilic design goes way beyond that.
The way you want to approach it is, how do you want people to feel in this space? Do you want them to feel energized and stimulated because the color and the shapes, the texture, the air quality will all help to make people feel more enlivened and engaged and productive and creative? So basically, what we do is we try and map out spaces and buildings. So, how do you want people to feel and act? What are the activities you want to deliver in these spaces? And how might we do that by using the various 25 biophilic patterns? And we start to sort of gently map that out. And then we kind of start to harden those designs up and go, well, we know that, let's say, certain colors are more calming and relaxing. And we use a kind of an idea called ecological valence theory that suggests that the colors that we find in nature can elicit a similar emotional and physiological response when we bring them into the built environment. So the colors like bright yellow remind us of summer sunshine and ripe crops. They're very warming, welcoming, summery, sociable colors. We often find them in cafeterias. They kind of welcome you in, like, wow, look at that. I feel like really enlivened. It's a great color. Whereas shades of blue are more calming, relaxing, and restorative. They remind you of pools of water or the sea. So particularly shades of blue are much more kind of calming and relaxing. Whereas other colors like reds and oranges and even greens as well are going to be more energizing and stimulating. They remind you of the fresh shoots of spring or ripe fruits and berries, and they're kind of more stimulating. So, it's an artificial representation of nature. Nobody says, oh, that's fake nature. It's just a sort of color introduction. But, we can sort of pull all these biophilic patterns together to create a physiological and a psychological and emotional response to a space that will actually support the intended activity and reduce some of those negative effects of that space.
I think colors should actually be a separate topic for a podcast. Colors is the fourth dimension of architecture.
It's a big topic.
Big one. But coming back to biophilic design and the principles, it seems like those often stimulate senses, different types of senses, but it seems like we're not talking that much about smell. And that's quite surprising for me, because smell is like one of the most important senses for a human being, considering what kind of impact it has on your memories and so on. And the only example that right now comes to my mind is if you use real wood and you don't kill it by, painting over with lacquer or some kind of paint, you can still, in theory, get the smell of wood. But that's about it. Is there more to explore in biophilic design?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the human senses evolved in close connection to nature. So our senses were alive and they were there to help us survive, thrive, flourish, to seek out opportunities for food and water, and to protect us against potential dangers, whether that danger was a bear or a tiger, but also the danger posed by rotting meat or stagnant water. So our senses are so vital, and now we find ourselves in the modern built environment, and we have so many other indicators of how we can survive that we've tended to sort of shut off the senses, but because of an over stimulation from kind of contemporary environments.
The overstimulation is coming from the sounds and the visual, but when it comes to the sense of touch and the sense of, I think the sense of touch is actually the one that's being the most overlooked, maybe in terms of interior design, as in everything's just smooth and easy to clean. And
I guess that is, it sort of represents that sort of that fear of nature, that sort of biophobia that particularly through the pandemic, that if you can't clean a surface, then it's going to be potentially dangerous to you. It's going to contain a virus. But actually, the more we remove all those sort of bacteria, some of which are, of course, dangerous, but many are actually beneficial to us. And it's worth remembering that inside all of us is a sort of solid kilogram of microbiome, living organism that is not human, that is just sort of gut bacteria that affects our digestive system, but also through the gut-brain axis, how we perceive the world and our decisions. So why is it sort of explains why when we smell something, we start to feel hungry. That's quite a weird sort of connection, isn't it? So, within all of us is a sort of large body of nature, and, we need to look after that. And so through the surfaces that we touch, whether it is our desk, our chairs. My dog is sitting over there in the corner of my studio, and he actually sort of has an enormous effect on my microbiome, studies have shown. Owning pets and animals it means that you interact with other species and you pick up many of the kind of epidermal microbiomes that inevitably sort of also then get introduced into your gut microbiome. So this sense of nature isn't, distinct from us. We're very much part of nature. It's inside us. We need to look after it to facilitate greater physical and mental well-being. And also that needs to sort of radiate out across the world through all of our senses.
Yeah, and I think we also, if we really want to introduce nature in our lives to a higher extent, we should also accept that the growth and the decay of nature, meaning maybe woods also aging and not looking that pretty, or the plants dying, hopefully not that often, but still, like, there is a growth. If there is a growth, there must also be the decay. Interesting thing about your dog, I think that maybe brings us to a bit of a different topic, animals. So how do you think we could implement animals a bit more in interior design or maybe in architecture scale? One of the examples I've worked on in the Netherlands was a bridge where we also designed little houses for bats. That was quite interesting. There are also facades with like those special panels for plants and insects, so we can really stimulate biodiversity here as well. Yeah. What else do you think we can do?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, that when, as human beings, we are so self-centered and so focused that buildings and cities are there to facilitate human function. We are part of nature. We're just one of millions of species that exist. And it's worth us remembering that, because we all know individually that nature makes us feel good. And yet at the same time, we're destroying it. And it's really important as we move forward that we take this more regenerative, self-sustaining approach to architecture that recognizes that, buildings benefit us and can benefit fauna and flora, but also may have disbenefits for other people and other species. And that we need to start taking that to account. And when we talk about inclusivity, it's not just about human inclusivity. It's surely got to be about a greater recognition and empathy towards other species, not just the ones we know within this human sphere.
Especially that I think we're responsible for, like 40% of the CO2 emission. So we have a lot to fix.
Yeah.
What can we do about that?
Yeah, I mean, we can start to create. There are many ways that we can start to think about ecosystem habitat creation for other species of fauna and flora, and that needs to sort of happen across a range of different, you might say, building professions. So whether it's through green corridors in cities, the introduction of parks or micro parks, we need to think of our buildings not just as rectilinear objects that contain spaces to provide functions for people to undertake, but also think about the impact that building has and the opportunities that exist. I had the great pleasure of interviewing Ken Yang from Hamza and Young recently at the RIBA and talking to him about his buildings. And he talks about this idea of a building not just being somewhere to occupy humans, but also this idea of ecosystem habitat creation. And as an architect and an ecologist, he starts to look at the kind of the vertical strata of a building and what species might occupy that building across a range of sort of vertical levels. And it's a really interesting way to think about it, like, oh yeah, suppose you could sort of allow birds to occupy one part and insects to another, and then sort of ground-based flora and fauna at another level. And then of course we've got rooftops and we've got opportunities across balconies and other levels to start to think about the way we might introduce nature, not just for the benefits of humans to go, wow, look at that looks amazing and futuristic and it's sort of green, but also just think about what other species might we consider. And there was an interesting project by this company that we've been working with for years, Interface, who worked with the founder by the biomimicry movement, Janine Benyus, to investigate the idea of factories as forests and think about one of their carpet tile factories, and not just about what it might take from an environment, but how it might collect resources and feed it back into the natural environment. So think about the footprint that a factory might take, and think about all the resources that might fall onto it or occur on it, whether that was sunlight or wind or water, and how it might collect some of those resources and then feed them and redistribute them back so that the impact of that building would be the same or potentially better than the impact of the forest in terms of how it might give back to the built environment in a regenerative way. And it's just like, yeah, why shouldn't it? Why couldn't we do that? We're clever enough. Is it just because we're so focused on sustainability and the mitigation of carbon emissions that we're not thinking about this sort of whole ecosystem and how we could be giving back more than just mitigating?
That's a topic for many students at the university. I remember myself, I did a biodegradable city with the Y factory at TU Delft. And there we were really looking into also different materials. We can build with straw, we can build with wood, stone, those natural materials. But then mycelium becomes more and more popular, right? So thinking really about also, if we're talking about nature, then we can also talk about biodegradability of architecture.
Yeah, I mean, we do need to be thinking of the circular system of those buildings and how we use biodegradable materials that come from a natural resource that are used for the duration of the building and then ultimately go back and biodegrade back into the natural environment.
Exactly. And I think it should also match the usage of that space a bit better. I think these days we use materials that can be with us for the next, 300-400 years, and yet it's going to be demolished way earlier than that. I think we have a couple of minutes more, so I'd like to maybe ask one more question. If we're thinking about nature, we're also talking about something that's constantly changing, right? So we're talking about it changing seasonally, it changing even daily, and architecture does not necessarily adapt to this kind of change that much. I mean, we have the idea of the circadian lighting. We've actually done it also in an office recently in Tallinn. For the ones who haven't listened to an episode about light, I'll just say that circadian light is using technology that changes the temperature of light and the intensity throughout the day, so it follows the natural human cycle. And in that way, it can enhance the productivity, the focus, which would be around noon. And then towards the evening or early in the morning, the light is a little bit more orange, and it sort of lets you start off the day and slowly relax towards the evening. So this is something that sort of can be an element in architecture that follows a little bit cycles of nature. What else do you think could be there?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, that we love to be in nature. And when we're in natural environments, they're rarely static. They're always moving and developing and changing and shifting. And we take enormous pleasure from the dynamic quality of that. And I mentioned that idea of non-rhythmic sensory stimuli, the movement that we find in nature, the leaves blowing in the wind on a tree or ripples moving across a pool of water, and how we get sort of great restorative pleasure from that. And yet when we create buildings, they're just, static rectilinear spaces that are quite mind-numbing, really. So it's interesting that we can think in a different way about buildings in a much more dynamic way, that with the introduction of plants and greenery, particularly if they're outside, they're going to go through a seasonal change. At the moment, the trees outside my window are just sort of bare branches, no leaves at all. But in a couple of months, we're going to start to see the buds, and we get those wonderful bright green shoots of life coming back, and they'll then sort of blossoms, and then the leaves in the summer. So we'll get this sort of dynamic cycle. So if we have the opportunity to look out onto plants and greenery, then we should be making the most of it in a way that reflects the sort of the kind of the lunar cycle and the seasons changing. When we start to bring plants indoors, they're more tropical plants. They don't have such sort of distinct seasonal changes. So the introduction of plants inside, you won't kind of see that level. But what you will see, and I noticed this in lockdown, is subtle changes throughout the day, the week, the months of those plants. Movement also happens in other ways, the introduction of water features, kinetic sculptures, the introduction of fireplaces and wood burning stoves, whether that's debatable from an air quality perspective. But I think there are a number of ways that we can create more dynamic spaces that create a greater sense of a perception of life, that perception of movement.
I think a good start would be also to really understand in full depth how the sunlight sort of penetrates the space throughout the day, throughout the months, but also throughout the seasons. And maybe if we went like fully modular, fully flexible, maybe we could also, rearrange elements, or maybe a meeting room in the summer would be a little bit closer to the windows. And then in winter, when we know that the sun goes a little bit deeper in the space, it could be sort of moved somewhere else, or the lounge area, or obviously it's brainstorming.
Yeah, I mean, there's no reason why you can't make more of natural light and ensure that you're maximizing on the potential for those beautiful shadows that happen in different ways across the year. I mean, it's something that we've sort of been doing as human beings throughout creation. Think about the kind of quality of Stonehenge and how at one particular point of year the sun is framed through Stonehenge. We could be transferring those sorts of ideas into our environments and thinking about the shadows that we get with bright sunlight and how that plays across the floor to create more dynamic spaces that subtly connect us to the time of day, or maybe the season, or maybe the weather, and takes us outside for a moment to go, oh yeah, it's winter. Look at the beautiful long shadows that we're getting through the space because the sun is low at this point in the year. And I mean, we really should be making more of that.
Yeah, I think so too. One last question then. You also teach how to sort of design with nature in mind. So could you tell me a little bit more? What is this course about? How people can actually join it?
Yeah, so I've been teaching biophilic design to architects across England, Europe, the Middle East, and the Far East for about 15 years. Often those ideas are more focused on commercial spaces where there is a sort of human cost. And then I realized that actually these ideas hadn't really been translated into residential or domestic environments. And that hadn't really been explored, in part because there isn't such a strong business case always for saying, when you bring elements of nature in, you're not going to raise productivity necessarily. It's going to be more difficult to measure. It's difficult to measure things like happiness. So What we did is we devised a course called Biophilic Design in the Home. And the idea is to introduce people to the principles of biophilic design in the first course, and then show how the 14 patterns of biophilic design can be implemented across spaces. And it's not necessarily about suggesting there's a very strict style. It's about helping people understand the different patterns, the tools that you can use to elicit different physical, mental, and emotional responses to space, and how you can use biophilic design in all spaces to support well-being of occupants. So it's basically an online course that we created. I've narrated it, and we've had sort of some really fantastic reviews from it. So it's been lovely to produce the course and then see that people are really enjoying it and getting something from it.
I think you've shared quite some of the knowledge you also share at your course here today with me and the audience. So thank you very much for that. I'll definitely share the link to your course. I think we've really covered quite a spectrum of all the possibilities, what designing with nature can be about. And something that was my main goal here was to really prove that nature-centric design is not just a trend, but a really powerful and transformative force in shaping our living environment, animals' living environment, and the planet Earth. So thank you so much for doing it with me today.
It's been a pleasure. It's been great to sort of talk ideas and just kind of like play around with all that stuff. So thank you for the opportunity to do that. It's been a pleasure, Magda.
Thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode. To avoid the fear of missing out, make sure you follow 4D Brainstorm here and on the other social media platforms like Instagram and LinkedIn. If you want to share your thoughts on this topic or would like to know how exactly this fourth dimension could be implemented in your design, just simply send an email to 4dbrainstorm@gmail.com. I'm really looking forward to exploring it further with you. Last but not least, if you're interested to know more about what I do, you can also check out the website 4dbrainstorm.com, a platform for free brainstorming in all dimensions and fields. Join the brainstorm and let's discover the fourth dimension together. Till next time!